Good afternoon. It is at once a pleasure and privilege to take part in this Melton Coalition conference and engage in your respective perspectives on the interface between the culture of the Jewish people and the cultures of other peoples, and to share mine with you. And I thank the leaders of the three Melton Centers for affording me this possibility. The perspectives on this topic which I want to present are those of Riboni Jews, sovereign, independent, free Jews, a term suggested by the Israeli Jewish thinker and educator Aryeh Elon. For reasons which I'll be happy to share with you in the discussion period, I will use the term free Jews all the time to connote Yehudim Riboniyim, sovereign, independent Jews. The perspectives of free Jews are different in ways that make real differences between them and those of Jews who Elon designates as Rabbani Jews, or Rabbinic Jews, or Jews of rabbinic persuasion. That's my formulation. In what follows, I will present the outstanding features of free Jews' world outlook, discuss these in the context of Rabbani Jews' world outlook, and in light of this exposition, I will explore free Jews' vision of Jewish culture and education in general, and in the context of their encounter with other people's respective visions of their own culture and education in particular. What are the outstanding features of free Jews' world outlook? Free Jews view Jews as one particular social, historical, human collectivity among other particular human collectivities comprising humanity worldwide. As a human collectivity, Jews are no less and no more unique than other particular social, historical, human collectivities. Like the latter, Jews have particular language, homeland, history, culture, etc. Taking their cue from the early thought of Echad Ha'am and the thought of the revolutionary, radical camp of Zionism, whose most articulate spokesperson was Yosef Chaim Brenner, free Jews define Jewishness in terms of a subjective sense of caring for and activist belonging to the Jewish people. Loyalty to the Jewish family expressed an active commitment to sustaining it and contributing to advancing its well-being and flourishing as a people is the singular obligation emanating out of this perspective on Jewishness. Due to the heated controversy that prevails among Jews worldwide today on the normative definition of what constitutes the well-being and flourishing of the Jewish people, it is not possible to provide here a clear substantive definition of these two notions. Irrespective, however, of the different oft opposing visions of Jews today on this matter of flourishing and health and wealth, all of them share together an active caring and engagement in the life of Jews today. However, I will offer the basic contours, the way free Jews view this matter, in my discussion below of free Jews' relationship to and uses of the Jewish past. In terms of the highly charged controversy between Echad Ha'am and in the later stage of his intellectual development and Yosef Chaim Brenner that engaged the attention of the Yiddish and Hebrew-speaking Jewish intelligentsia worldwide for over 3 years, 1911 to 1913. I always wanted to write an article like that. It's unbelievable. We can say that free Jews contend that person's Jewishness is defined by their active loyalty to the Jewish family and not to this family's spirit or culture, however the latter are interpreted. This active engagement in the life of the Jewish people rejects any carte blanche obligation to be faithful to the spirit of this family, and it affords Jews total freedom of thought in general, and in the context of choosing freely the traditions they want to keep or discard from the Jewish historical cultural legacy in particular. In the free Jews' perspective, there are not any a priori Jewish theological, ideological, or cultural ideals and practices Jews are compelled to accept or to undertake. Active membership in the Jewish club is not membership in a theological and or philosophical club. In free Jews' eyes, human beings' very humanity is embedded in their responsibility to choose the ways to sustain and nourish their lives, or, heaven forbid, to hurt and harm them. Consequently, any attempts to impose religious or cultural duties on members of the Jewish family are unconscionable in the eyes of free Jews. At the same time, free Jews are well aware that they are not blank tablets, that their pasts define the opening boundaries of their choices, and that knowledge and understanding of their pasts is a prerequisite of their making intelligent choices regarding the political, cultural roads on which they want to travel in the present into the future. This line, spoken by one of the protagonists in William Faulkner's play, Requiem for a Nun, quote, "The past is never dead. It is even not the past," end quote, echoes strongly in their airs. In Friedju's eyes, it is very likely less pernicious to conduct one's life on the very mistaken notion that the past is dead and life begins with me in the present presence of myself, a kind of form, in my opinion, of cultural narcissism, than to conduct it on the basis of submission and subservience to any heteronomous set of laws and rules, but the former is clearly no less foolish and foolhardy than the latter. Literacy regarding the cultural foundations of the ethnic group to whom a particular people belong affords its members cultural thickness, depth, and breadth. Cultural ignorance is not bliss. Consequently, free Jews maintain it is their responsibility and right to employ their own as well as the community members with whom they affiliate to choose their usable past. That is, to choose out of the rich multivocal texts and practices that are found in the Jewish historical, cultural, religious traditions and experiences, as well as from the rich array of such texts and practices, voices, etc., in other people's cultures, the ones they wish to implement and perpetuate in their own and their community's life. A profound respect for persons and an ardent, proactive interest in contributing to the humanization of the world, making it a more just, fair-minded, user-friendly place in which to live and flourish, are two main components in free Jews' worldview and political cultural ethos. They derive these components from an array of different sources and life experiences, each free Jew inheriting, discovering, and embracing a specific individual selection and integration of them. At the same time, it is reasonable to claim that these sources from the Jewish past play a role in the mental, cultural, ethical makeup of most free Jews. One, the prophets in the biblical period and prophetical traditions in later rabbinic culture. These sources' insistence on the decisive importance of care for the weak and oppressed, social justice and fairness, in short, of ethical goodness as a decisive component in a normative Jewish ethos. Two, specific dimensions of the Jewish historical experience in the diaspora. Free Jews feel and contend that the very difficult trials and tribulations Jews underwent throughout history as a recognizable alien, weak, and exposed minority should encourage Jews to develop keen capacities of social criticism, sensitize them to human suffering, and place them at the forefront of movements of proactive pursuit of social justice. Consequently, the question of questions free Jews bring to bear on the Jewish sources of the past is, to what extent do they deepen the Jews' humanity, increase their ability to scrutinize the world critically, encourage and inspire them to humanize the world, and lend them the necessary tools to realize these objectives? Placing their position in the context of the very prevalent Jewish concern and clamor for Jewish continuity today, mentioned before, it can be stated that these free Jews focus on the ethical characteristics disclosed in the real lives Jews lead and the life forms and practices, political, social, etc., they undertake and construct. Their penultimate concern is the ethical quality of Jewish life today and not its continuity with Jewish cultures of the past. For free Jews, sources from the Jewish past serve as an inspiration in the construction of their political cultural orientation, ethos, and practice, but they never serve as an authority. Indeed, free Jews take serious issue with those autonomous secular humanist Jews who are engaged over the past 20, 30 years in what they themselves, as well as many sociologists, call the Israeli Jewish Renaissance movement, whose proponents seek to open the traditional bookshelf to secular, liberal, or socialist humanist Jews. These Jewish Renaissance road riders, henceforth I'm going to call them JRRRs, couch their interest in the return to the Jewish bookshelf in oppositional terms towards the Orthodox uses and abuses of it in their eyes. Specifically, the JRRs strive to reclaim and redeem Jewish traditional texts and practices from what they view as the ethnocentric, myopic, ultranationalist hands of orthodoxy and replace them with democratic, humanistic ones. Free Jews' opposition to JRRs stems from the contention that they're turning and returning inexorable. Thank you very much. Make it an adverb, please.
Inexorably.
Thank you. Inexorably entraps them into the very collaboration with traditional religious Jews they so vehemently oppose. Once free Jews enter the poker psukim game, they cannot reject its ground rules and simply leave the table. In the words of Aryeh Kaspi, a militant liberal secular Jew, in his response to the emergence in the late 1990s of the JRRs, quote, in a cultural war like in all power struggles, the people who determine the playing field win. The study of Jewish sources in the code name of engaging in and being engaged by rabbinic literature, Judaism, Jewish sources, and culture of the past are located on a Jewish religious playing field. This is the fact, whether we like it or dislike it, end quote. What is the poker psukim game, you may ask? In his critique of the ultimate futility of Israeli Jewish religious and historical secular sectors' typical procedure to support their positions they take on political social issues facing the Israeli polity, by anchoring them in different and often imposing passages from the Jewish legal and philosophical tradition, Beit Michael, a well-known Israeli journalist and cultural commentator, he himself, by the way, an Orthodox Jew, suggested this phenomena be called the game of poker psukim. Due to the breadth and depth of the Jewish rabbinic tradition, it is possible to find passages in it that support every possible political, social, economic orientation. This being the case, the authoritative position regarding any of these issues has much more to do with the interpreter's worldview than with the words written in the text from which they quote. Placing this in hermeneutic terms, what is decisive is the read, interpreted text, not the written one. Or following the words of Umberto Eco, who teaches that text, paraphrase, are lazy machines, text or customs, traditions, are lazy machines requiring a great deal of human effort to make them work. It is clear that by force majeure, persons hold the leading proactive position in this relationship. Free Jews' refusal to play the poker psukim game stems precisely out of their uncompromising insistence on basing and developing their worldview, their politics, practices, ethos, and ethics independently, without any a priori commitment to anchoring these in the books, sources, and texts on the Jewish bookshelf, as well as on the bookshelves of other cultures. The ethnic or religious origin of human ideas, values, and practice are not of any decisive importance or concern to free Jews. The latters, these ideas, truthfulness, helpfulness, life-enhancing powers are crucial, not the historical, ethnic, or religio-cultural stamp on their origins. In the light of this last point, they are open to learning and often do learn important ideas and practices from the wisdom of other peoples, cultures, and readily employ them in their own lives and the lives of the members of their community. They have no interest and do not engage in establishing clearly defined borders between Jewish and between other people's cultures. They reject the distinction popular among Jews of rabbinic persuasion between language and literature, between authenticity and relevance. In the free Jews' understanding, literature determines language, or more precisely, literature and language are one. Everything is literature. In their eyes, authentic Jews can and do exist. Clear-cut authentic Judaisms do not and cannot exist. Who is an authentic Jew? Jews who engage in a constant dialogue between their authentic selves, to the degree they can define the latter clearly, and the many diverse spheres of knowledge and culture of their peoples and other peoples past, as well as these spheres as they are ever becoming and being constructed in the present. And authenticity and relevance complement and do not contradict each other. Free Jews respect and often derive considerable pleasure from the diverse and hybrid-like nature of contemporary cultures in general, and of the many versions of contemporary Jewish cultures in particular. In the way of several illustrations of this last point, free Jews derive much pleasure, contentment, from the usually discernible Hebrew linguistic and Jewish cultural references that naturally freely and spontaneously emerged out of so many of Israel's cultural productions and products, such as the sculptures of Menashe Kadishman, the poetry of Yonah Valach, the pop songs of Dag Nachash, Arik Einstein, Yudit Ravitz, Ehud Banai, the novels of Aleph and Yeshua, the short stories of Edgar Keret, the plays of Hanoch Levine, and many, many, many more. In their eyes, the natural emergence of these cultural creations, unplugged consciously and programmatically into Jewish sources, signifies the realization of one of the pillars of the secular Zionist radical cultural aspiration to transform the Jews from a people of the book, Am HaSefer, the one and only book, and its rabbinic interpretation, to a people of literature, Am Sifruti, many books in Achad Am's early formulation that got him into much trouble and helped him become more conservative later. Most importantly, in my estimation, as I already stated above, Free Jews' commitment to a democratic worldview and ethos, to political activism based on a tireless effort to increase fairness, justice, and equality, is based on their profound existential sense that it is a right and just road on which human persons in general and Jews in their particularity are called to reveal. When all is said and done, like in the Turei Karta, in a different direction, these free Israeli Jews are the uncompromising proponents and guardians, or try to be, of an Israeli polity that strives to be a truly democratic and just one. What is Free Jews' vision of Jewish culture and education? Free Jews' vision of Jewish culture and education is best understood in the context of present-day reigning, hegemonic, rabbinic Jews' visions of them. In rabbinic visions, the overarching aim of Jewish education is acculturation, acculturating the new generation of Jewish children into the ideas and practices of the Jewish historical cultural traditions, such as acculturating, as example, towards internalizing the practice and ideas of the Jewish life and holiday cycles. The subject that matters the most in the curriculum is Judaism, the rabbinic tradition in any of the ways this tradition is interpreted, from ultra-Orthodox to secular humanist interpretations and everything in the in-between between them. And the foremost educational challenge is how to make this language of Jewish culture, this authentic Jewish culture, speak to the young generation so that it becomes relevant literature in their present-day lives. Free Jews' vision of Jewish education differs considerably from this vision. In their eyes, the overarching aim of Jewish education is facilitating the development of Jews who will adopt an ethos of active ethical care and concern for the political, social, economic, cultural well-being of Jews and other peoples worldwide. Jews themselves are the subject matter, the subjects that matter the most in Free Jews' paradigm of Jewish education. More specifically, the political, social, economic, and cultural activities and actions of Jews today, when Jews themselves or others view them as expressions of their Jewishness in the world, are the core subject matter, the subject that matters the most in the Free Jews' practice and vision of Jewish culture and education. In light of this, the critical reflective exploration of the many rich and diverse forms and types of present-day Jews' political cultural construction comprise and constitute the primary text of Jewish education. Exploring the question of the ways Jews today relate to their historical memories, texts, and practices, the roles the latter play in their lives, and the ethical, spiritual ramifications of the culture they construct through them is at the heart of the Free Jews' version of Jewish education. As stated, to repeat myself, in the first part of my presentation, Free Jews' determination of the usable sources for their vision of Jewish education is based on these sources' capacity to lend an affirmative response to this major overarching question, the question of questions. To what extent do they or can they be interpreted so that they enrich and deepen the Jews' humanity, increase their ability to scrutinize the world critically, to encourage and inspire Jews to humanize the world, and lend them the necessary tools to realize this latter objective? More specifically, are these sources sensitive to the present powers, capacity, worlds of the Jews being educated? 2, do they facilitate the growth and amplification of an ethos of active, ethical, interpersonal, social, political care and responsibility with their own community, society, and polity, as well as to others outside of them? Do they offer these learners theoretical and practical tools through which they themselves can contribute to the construction of political, social, and economic frameworks that are more just than those of the present? And do they lend the time and place and space to express, for these children, to express their deepest feelings and aspirations freely and creatively. To sum up, the Free Jews paradigm of Jewish culture places Jewish existence before Jewish essence. In this paradigm, there is no given objective essential Judaism existing out there like a Platonic idea outside and beyond the living Jews of today. Much more than Judaism or Jewish culture makes us, we make them. Freedom of thought, inquiry, and expression of people is one of the hallmarks of the Free Jews ethos. This ethos focuses on the spiritual ethical ramifications of the actual real lives of Jews that are ever being constructed in the present. Free Jews are as confident as human beings can be confident about matters that cannot be entirely under their control, that the existence of Jews as a particular historical collectivity is quite certain and secure. Free Jews totally reject compartmentalization. All attempts to create compartments, divisions between Jewishness, Judaism, Jewish culture, ethics, humanists, and other particular human cultures. This rejection of compartmentalization is at the core of the absence of the anxious need common among Jews of rabbinic persuasion to distinguish between the internal, authentic, and genuine, and the external, imitative, and disingenuous in Jewish culture. Free Jews turn to the sources of Jewish historical culture and employs them to extent possible as one of the important possible resources to inspire learners' will to engage in ethical acts that benefit human others and improve the world. At the same time, they strongly protest and struggle against the use of such sources as resources that engender ethnocentrism and extreme nationalism. Free Jews strive to develop Jews who will want and will be able to construct a comprehensive Jewish culture that will offer meaningful, compelling responses to the burning issues of society and the world. Consequently, Free Jews follow the educational path of holistic development, that is, cognitive, affective, behavioral, and ethical development over that of socialization and acculturation. Katuv kan tam velo nishlam.
The object of my paper is to try and understand the problematic concerned with the question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew in the present from a broad historical, social, and cultural perspective. I'll try to show, on the one hand, in what way the contemporary problematic concerned with Jewish learning and the non-Jew may be seen as a late development of the meeting between Judaism and modernity, already begun in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, while on the other hand, I'll emphasize the ways in which we are today speaking of a new and perhaps unique problematic affected by the post-World War II high-tech revolution and subsequent postmodern processes of globalization and social acceleration. Toward the end of the paper, I'll try and establish the rationale according to which, and here's a touching point, I'll try to establish the rationale according to which I maintain that the healthy continuation of both Jewish and human existence from a Jewish perspective require in the present an understanding of relations between Judaism and humanity that draws from early cultural Zionist understandings of these. Before continuing, however, with the historical and philosophical dimensions of my discussion, I'd like to concretize things a bit by bringing up our question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew in connection with a relatively early Mishnah taken from Masechet Avot, paying attention to both the general ethical content of this Mishnah as well as the ethnic particularity of its presentation, and that's an important tension that's going to carry all the way out through here, like the ethical content, which would be very difficult to put in a particularistic context, and yet the content is being presented through a language. The presentation is very particularistically ethnic, and it's that tension that I'd like to build on in regard to this Mishnah. In truth, I could have chosen for this purpose almost any Jewish source or text because I haven't done a review, a survey to state it quantitatively, but this just happens again and again, that you have content that can be considered ethical or universally ethical content, and the presentation is almost always has something particularly Jewish or Jewishly ethnic about it. My purpose in any event, as I said, is to highlight the manner in which the text presents the universal as an aspect of the particular. The Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Masechet Avot, the 10th Mishnah, begins with a declaration that apparently refers to the concept of divine justice and retribution. 7 calamities come to the world for 7 key transgressions. For time, I'm just, presenting the things and not bringing in the Hebrew, even though that would be important. The universal ethical value of the Mishnah is unmistakable, particularly when towards the end of it, it says that plagues come to the world when capital offenses are not handed over to the courts for adjudication, and continues, sword comes to the world because of inui hadin, ivut hadin, v'hora'at halacha, Shelo kahalacha, that a sword comes to the world as a result of delayed justice, perversions of justice, and teaching the law improperly. And I think that everybody would agree that as far as ethical statements go, these are pretty good ethical statements that it would be worthy to learn from. But I'm more interested in the ability for these statements not only to be stated, but to arouse and inspire through subtle reference to the historicity of the ethnic culture that created the text and determined its manner of presentation. And I think that one can say that only when one has sufficient familiarity with the images, memories, and judgments contained in the ever-growing Jewish heritage, only then can one appreciate the text for all it has to offer. To cut off the content from the ethnic presentation damages the learning of the text. Learning the Mishnah with the understandings and sensitivities of Jewish existence through the ages, it becomes apparent that this Mishnah is not simply teaching a principle of divine retribution, determining which transgression brings about which form of retribution. It also contains an element of theodicy, meant to give meaning to the ancient Jewish experience of destruction and exile. But mostly, through the recollection of these, this Mishnah makes an inspiring statement to the effect that the only society worthy of existence is one that is socially responsible and just. That is a society that takes capital crime seriously, ensures justice without unnecessary delay, and prevents subverting the law for personal gain. That this Mishnah associates the calamities recalled with Israel's own experience of destruction and exile can be seen in that the calamities being mentioned are strongly reminiscent of images taken from Lamentations leading up to the destruction of the first temple, including siege, hunger, thirst, civil violence, destruction by the sword, the decrease in population through exiled wild animals and pestilence. I mean, the images are just too strong to ignore. Concerning the need for familiarity with images and symbols taken from the ethnic heritage that produced the text, let us note the subtlety with which even the ritual transgressions listed in the Mishnah evoke values of justice and social responsibility. Famines and plagues come to the world, says the Mishnah, from not paying the ritual tithe and the abrogating of the sabbatical year. Now, anybody who has even like a minimal amount of knowledge, can then see these are ritual transgressions whose fundamental religious significance is that of reverence for divine sovereignty and celebration of God as creator. But one who's familiar with Jewish texts and their ever-developing literary heritage will also know by implication that abstention from giving tithes brings about calamity, according to the Mishnah, inasmuch as it includes the abstention from the giving of tithes to the poor. It doesn't have to be said explicitly. If you don't give tithes, then you're not giving tithes to the poor. or that the abrogation of laws pertaining to the sabbatical year is considered to be offensive to God inasmuch as it stops short the redemption of individuals and their families from perpetual poverty, debt, and slavery as decreed by divine law. So the question as to how one might teach such a text to Jews and non-Jews requires, of course, an ability to translate the world of ideas, images, and values contained in the text into the conceptual and emotional language of the learning recipient. But as I will now try to show, in present-day social and cultural realities, this ability to translate from one language to another has itself become increasingly difficult. The difficulty, I claim, stems from a withering of the ethnic aspects of human experience, not only of Jews, but of human beings in general, and what I think is the subsequent shallowing of the human spirit following the postmodern processes of globalization and social acceleration. Up to this point, my purpose was to show the manner in which Jewish texts very often reflect upon matters of universal human significance through the particularist lens of Jewish ethnicity, and ask if indeed the universal, and this is, to me is an eye-opening question, is the universal ever made present, not in the context of a particular cultural language? The fusion of the universal and the particular in the above Mishnah is perhaps but a single illustration of the points already made by the second Aliyah philosopher and labor pioneer, Aaron David Gordon, when he said that universal humanity taken by itself is an abstraction that has no content, and that in reality there is no universal humanity except that which is created by individual peoples and cultures. But the trajectory of modern Jewry that ultimately gave rise to the contemporary question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew did not arise upon the backdrop of Gordon's East European or Land of Israel milieu, but rather from developments that stem from the meeting between Judaism and modernity in Central and Western Europe in the mid to late 19th century. Let's therefore attempt to trace a bit the fate of Jewish ethnicity in this context. Now, in introductory books and university courses, the 18th century Enlightenment is correctly presented as pivotal in the modernization of Jewish life, particularly with regard to the social and political aspects of the Enlightenment vision of a universal humanity. I think, however, that the Zionist philosopher, historian, and Bible critic, Yechezkel Koifman, was correct when he wrote in his book, Gola v'Nechar, or Exile and Alienation, that in the time of the Enlightenment, universal humanity was still perceived more as a long-term ideal than as a historical given. Neither for the 18th century European Wiesel or Moses Mendelssohn, nor for their 19th century followers in the East European Haskalah movement, for none of these did the idea of universal humanity displace the particularity of Jewish culture in practice or ideal. Again, as Koifman said, humanity, universal humanity, was still a distant ideal, and the aspect of humanity was rather dreamed of as a future place of meeting between particular peoples and cultures that would take many years of work to realize. The meeting between Judaism and modernity, following the establishment of modern civil societies, emancipation, and industrialization in Western and Central Europe of the 19th century, is, however, a whole different story. For here, the political and economic realities of Western society already constituted for the Jews a demographic shift involving a high degree of social, political, and cultural integration in the modern civil society shared with non-Jews. The dream of a universal humanity could not remain in the context of emancipation, nation-states, and modern civil society, a long-term ideal to be worked for of the time. The future idea of humanity rather became embedded in the call for the immediate realization of humanity from within a process of social and cultural integration that had already begun. And here we can see the process that has just become speeded up and deepened in our own time. This is not to say that ethnic identities and heritages did not play an important role in 19th century emancipationist ideologies. assimilationist protestation notwithstanding, expressions of Jewish ethnic particularity abound in the construction of classical reform ideology as the most important example. As late as mid-20th century America, there was talk of a Judeo-Christian heritage endemic of Western civilization, which should be noted. It's easy to see that this is a view that many Jews held on to because it united them with non-Jews in the dream of a shared humanity, while acknowledging the distinct religious and ethnic origins of the shared future. Right? It's a Judeo-Christian heritage. And just in parentheses, as I'm listening to all of our papers here, I have a question. Whatever happened to the Judeo-Christian heritage? And if today it's possible to talk about it the way it was 40 years ago? But that's a side point. What the contemporary question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew has in common with the roles of Jews and Judaism in world culture at the time of emancipation is the precedence given to the shared social sphere above that of ethnic particularity. And this is one of the things that I want to emphasize, because a lot of it, Avi Sagi has this thing about pnim v'chutz. It's very important in these questions to always ask what's coming from the creative energy that arises within and what is stamped or comes from the outside. And these are the questions we're dealing with. So that's something that's in common between the contemporary questions and those that came up already in the 19th century. But our present situation differs in that following the high-tech revolution, digital communications, globalization, and subsequent social acceleration, the shared borders of civil society have been pushed back into the far reaches of personal, family, and community life, to the point of obliterating, or maybe almost obliterating, ethnicity. The term globalization was, of course, first applied to the economic sphere and referred to the creation of a world economy beyond the regulatory activities of the nation state. But this was but one facet of the transformation of human existence brought about through the digitalization of world communication. There's been an equally strong effect upon human life in the realm of culture and identity. At one point, fairly close to the beginning of their book, Powers of the Diaspora, Daniel and Jonathan Boyarin comment on the frightening pace through which the communities we identify with and the languages we speak are formed and then break apart as they travel through the links of the internet. In his book entitled Social Acceleration, Hartmut Rosa posited that the fragmentation, pluralization, multiplication of the self that is so often celebrated in postmodern philosophy is but the consequence of social acceleration brought about by contemporary technology. The result with regard to ethnic identities and cultural heritages, I quote, is that self-projects that are oriented towards stability appear to contemporary consciousness to be anachronistic and condemned to failure, while forms of identity based on flexibility and immediate readiness to change are systematically favored. The question of Jewish learning, of course, arises in the Jewish studies departments in the universities today as a result of Jewish study having become, for multiple reasons, an area of study for Jews and non-Jews alike, while the university here is a clear extension of modern and postmodern civil society. So we learn together without being permitted to make distinctions, a topic that might require certain ethnic distinctions in order to understand the subject matter. But the question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew arises, of course, also in family, community, and synagogal study groups. And this is a result of the merging of Jewish and non-Jewish society to the point that the meeting between Jew and non-Jew that once took place in the outside civil sphere now takes place within the family and the communities themselves. All of these direct our attention to the fact that the Jewish cultural tradition is no longer decisive in the determination of Jewish family and community life, And it is questionable as to whether or not Jewish family and community life is even in a state that it can produce any kind of long-term commitment to Jewish cultural traditions, or at least I think we should formulate that as a question. Where does Jewish family and community life stand in regard to the ability to be engaged consistently, even in the future, in things related to Jewish learning? By the way, the things that I'm talking about here, I also thought manifest very nicely, even though that wasn't the point, in Arnie's book, The Jew Within, where he and Steve Cohen are actually documenting the transition from the community experience of Judaism to the privatization or personalization. What I didn't find in that book is what I'm trying to talk to is what's been the cost of that in terms of the possibility of Jewish spiritual creativity vis-a-vis Jews and vis-a-vis the non-Jewish world. In any event, our question of Jewish learning and the non-Jew concerns not only the continued and future existence of Jews and Judaism as a people or ethnic group, but also the character of humanity and its ability to appreciate such things as wisdom, awe, and perhaps righteousness. It is a question of ethnicity as an aspect of human life in general. In this situation, we must ask, what do we mean when we use the term Jewish learning? Do we mean Jewish learning in the broad sense of the word, that is, in the sense of learning informed by the intergenerational dialogue maintained in the past between the long-term historical heritages of Judaism produced from the constant study, interpretation, and reinterpretation of Jewish sources in the particular ethnic context of Jewish family and community life? Or do we mean rather any study of Jewish sources undertaken by Jews and non-Jews regardless of the family and community heritages informing it? And two, if we are referring to Jewish learning in the more traditional old sense that requires Jewish community and family life with some type of heritage that's common to the people involved, then we must ask the question on a practical level, is a reconstruction of Jewish and family and community life in the present age of digitalization, globalization, and social acceleration at all possible? And if regarding this question there is any difference between Jewish life in Israel and the diaspora. Speaking frankly, my own interest in Jewish learning is first and foremost the continuation of the Jewish people as a historical people, and I believe that Mordechai Kaplan was absolutely right when he determined in the middle third of the 20th century that the future existence of Jewish civilization, in America at any rate, is dependent upon a reconstruction of Jewish community life in the context of guidelines formed by the broader civil society. I believe this need is even more acute today, but because of the reasons I mentioned above, such a reconstruction of Jewish family and community life is even more difficult to realize than it was in Kaplan's time, and it's hard to discern where Kaplan's vision went. It wasn't picked up in the end. I cannot answer the question as to whether or not in the demographics determined by globalization and social acceleration, the reconstruction of the type of ethnic family and community life required for the continuation of Jewish existence as the existence of historical people. I can't determine if this is still possible in the North American diaspora or not. I am more confident in Israel, where the challenge is somewhat different, though in Israel there are enough other challenges to be concerned about. It's not a matter of any kind of triumphalism. There are demographic differences and among all the other differences. This, in any event, is where I think that the heritage of cultural Zionism is so important. The vision of a Jewish people as a social and cultural being that lives through the ages by its own intergenerational dialogue, and at the same time is a part of humanity in dialogue with world cultures, I believe to be the best, the most paradigm to direct Jewish education, both for Jews and with non-Jews in the future, because if we cut out the ethnic element, then there's no longer a chance of dialogue. It's between one anonymous group with another anonymous group. It's the ethnicity that nullifies the anonymity and allows for there to be a meeting. For Jewish learning to have any real educational impact, it is necessary for the individuals taking part in the learning process to share a deep familiarity and empathy with the culture that created the texts being learned. But for this challenge to be met, a reconstruction of Jewish family and community life in which a dialogue with Jewish sources stands as a constant center is essential.
Thank you.